one of the things I did, and I did it gradually, but it was, and I don't know if it has anything to do with anything, is one of them was a stretching back where the rear, you've got their rear legs on something, and then you have them lean forward so that they're really stretching their rear legs out. And, I didn't do it excessively. And I did notice it made a slight change in his extension jumping, that sometimes he tends to do loosely tucked rear legs. I mean, a real relaxed jumping style that's his choice. I like that style. I think they don't have to butt flip or anything. But then I noticed, wow, sometimes he's doing this because of that exercise. But now going back, I'm like, oh, was that one of the things that I put a little bit of strain in, by like when I was doing too much yoga, I put a little bit too much stretch in my hip flexors, and I ended up with a lower back problem. So I was just, do you have any thoughts on some of these things we think are benign that might not be?
It's very hard to say because, like I said in the webinar bits as well, there's so much we don't really know. And there's unfortunately also so much that we can extrapolate from humans, from horses, and what we do, especially when it comes to agility, flyball, and dog diving to some extent. I think we need dog-specific data, and there's not an awful lot out there at the moment, which makes it a bit harder to say this is what you should do or this is what you shouldn't do. And on top of that, it is very dog dependent. And the difficult thing with dogs is going to be that they will, to a very big degree, aim to please.
Yeah.
And they will potentially work through things that are not always as comfortable as ideal just because they think that that's what you're asking them to do. Mm-hmm. So that might mask quite a lot in terms of what they can do, what they should do. So it's hard to say whether you can actually overdo things like that, especially when it comes to relatively static behaviors or with minimal movement, and much more from a stabilizing point of view. It's relatively hard to really cause any injuries that way because there's very limited force involved other than gravity. That being said, if there's an underlying weakness and they try to compensate in ways that we may potentially not always pick up on, then that can get us into a bit more trouble than we sort of bargained for.
Yeah. Well, and I've just been thinking about what happened from 1,000 different angles to try to understand, how I could have played a role in this, how I likely did play a role in this, because I'm the one who's initiating all the things we're doing. And so I don't want to repeat myself, of course. But I am dying to know what you thought about this whole series of events that, really sounded like bilateral TPLO. And it was great that I had just done your webinar before these series of appointments, because then I didn't know what they were going to tell me. I thought it was going to be lower back pelvis stuff just based on what it looked like to me. But then when I was hearing that, it's like, oh my God, I just heard about that. And oh no, I don't want that. But how he could go from the minimal drawer movement, to no drawer movement.
So I thought about it quite a bit in terms of what the series of events is, and there's a few things that make it a bit harder to put everything together and to puzzle everything together, if you want. Because one, you've got the part that is something that is relatively subjective. There's different people that have done different things at different times. So that in itself is going to make findings not always as easy to compare. So there's no real way of knowing, without wanting to doubt any of the findings of the people involved. It may very well be that the technique of people is a bit different. Their interpretation of what is movement or what they feel is a bit different. Level of experience might be a bit different. Those things can already play a role without anything ever happening. So that is just a bit of a background part where we can say, it's going to be hard to really say we can compare this one to one. The other thing is going to be that your cruciate ligament is something that is very, very complex, not from a structure point of view, well, to some extent from a structure point of view, but more from a functional point of view, because you've got different strands running in slightly different orientations, which makes that, depending on the flexion angle of your knee joint, parts of your cruciate ligament and parts of your cranial or your caudal ligament are going to be put on a more strain in a certain angle, which is going to make that in some angles you may have just a little bit more movement than in another angle. So again, when it comes to
meaning the angle of the stifle joint or the angle, okay, just to clear, okay.
So depending on how much flexion or extension you'll have your stifle joint in,
okay,
will give you some sort of laxity, inverted commas, along parts of your cruciate ligament.
mm-hmm.
And that is the same for your caudal and your cranial one.
Mm-hmm.
So even that on its own can then obviously play a role in what the findings are on clinical exam.
Mm-hmm.
The good thing is that at least the part of the investigation, if you want, with under sedation, because otherwise you already have your whole muscular bracing and all these things that come into play as well, which makes it even harder to interpret. In my experience, dogs that have an unstable stifle will have an unstable stifle.
Okay, and so you don't think, I mean, because of these COVID restrictions, you know, these appointments were so spread out and he had so much rest that he went from looking really weak in the rear, you know, at the first appointment to at the second appointment, he was already starting to look better on off-leash hikes, you know, more power from the rear, more normal movement. And then by the third appointment, I was looking at him thinking the last couple of weeks before, he was like looking really good on hikes, so really solid. Is it possible that you know, that he had something that, you know, that made the muscles weak and that the muscles got stronger and they created more stability for some minor thing that's part of who he is versus an injury? Or
absolutely. The thing is, around your stifle joint, it's not just the cruciate that creates your stability, and it's part of one of the things that we need to work on when we have a dog that has a fully ruptured cruciate and has a TPLO. Doing a TPLO on its own is not gonna be enough. We need to get build-up of muscles around that to provide long-term stability, especially when we then bring in movement, when we bring in directional changes, and all these things. So when it comes to what has potentially happened, it may very well be that there's been a very, very minor strain of that ligament to just sort of nearly scratch the surface almost, if you want, that caused a bit of discomfort, a bit of offloading, a bit of muscle wastage, and that sort of triggered the whole series of events. Now, the other thing is going to be is that your knee joint is pretty much the most complex one of the whole body. So there's so many different parts to it that all need to work together spot on perfectly. If that's not the case, we're going to have issues. And it may not be the original issue that is going to poke up its head, if you want. Mm-hmm. It may be one of the consequences of the original issue. So again, all those things come into play, and it's going to be very, very hard to know. It's a bit of a chicken and egg story in the end. Mm-hmm. And it may not always be as relevant which was first.
Yeah. Well, I remember. Oh, go ahead.
What's going to be relevant is how to store it and how to go back to normal and how to go back to a functional joint. That's in the end what we need.
Yeah.